This video is for commentary and analysis under fair use. The views expressed are my own, based on publicly available information and my interpretation of it. Some families have a secret language, not codes, not passwords, something quieter, a way of saying something without saying all of it. And after a murder conviction, that private language can become part of the story. And once you hear it, it's hard to unhear. Hi, I'm Stina. Welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. If you're new here, I look at true crime through a communication lens. My background is in communication, so I'm usually not trying to recreate every timeline detail or cover every piece of evidence. And actually, that would bore me to tears if I had to do that on my videos. So I'm much more interested in the language, the framing, the patterns, and the way people explain themselves in public. For anyone new to this story, Mackenzie Shirilla was 17 years old when she drove her car into a building in Strongsville, Ohio, killing her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, and their friend, Davion Flanagan. Prosecutors argued that this was not an accident. They argued that Mackenzie intentionally accelerated into that building, like at almost 100 miles an hour. The judge agreed, and Mackenzie was convicted of murder and sentenced to 15 years to life. Her family has continued to insist this was just a tragic accident. But today, we're not going back through every piece of evidence in this case. We're looking at something I almost missed. In one of my recent videos, a viewer pointed out a line from Steve Shirilla's interview that stood out to her. It was when he said a variation of, "Mackenzie told my wife everything. She wasn't trying to harm herself because my wife would know it, because Mackenzie told my wife everything, and Mackenzie talked to my wife all the time." And at first, I didn't know if there was much to say about it, because in a lot of families, this would not be unusual. So maybe Mackenzie was just closer to her mom, or Natalie was the emotional parent, or maybe there were just things that Mackenzie never talked with Steve about. But then I started putting that statement beside the other pieces. Because Steve does not just say Mackenzie was close to Natalie. He repeatedly uses Natalie as the person who would know what Mackenzie meant, what Mackenzie felt, and what Mackenzie would or would not have said. And then there is another layer. Mackenzie and Natalie did not just talk often. According to the family's own interviews, they also shared a private family language, Carney Talk. And Steve says he does not speak it. This is when the line started to feel different to me. Because now the question is not simply, was Mackenzie closer to her mother? The question is, was Natalie positioned as the one who knew, because she and Mackenzie shared a communication channel that Steve was not fully inside of and part of? And I want to be clear up front also. I am not saying this family had some elaborate secret code necessarily. And I am not saying every word was planned or calculated, or anything suspicious or nefarious was going on with that. What I'm talking about, though, is a family language, private shorthand, familiar framing, the way people inside a family can understand meanings, excuses, tones, and implications that may not be obvious to everyone else. And in a case where intent is everything, that kind of language really is important. Because the issue is not only what Mackenzie said, it is who got to decide what Mackenzie meant. We're looking at one thread. How the family talks about Mackenzie, how Natalie is positioned as the person who understands her, and how that interpretation becomes part of the story the public is asked to accept. So, in this first clip, Steve is talking about Dominic Russo and the idea that Mackenzie and Dominic may have been breaking up. Listen to where Steve places the certainty.
If she was going to break up with this kid, she would have told my wife, and that never happened. Okay.
That line may seem simple at first. If Mackenzie and Dominic, or Dom, were going to break up, Steve says Mackenzie would have told Natalie. And because Natalie apparently did not hear that, Steve treats it as evidence that it was not happening. But listen to the structure of the argument. It is not just, I don't believe they were breaking up. It is, if that were true, if that were really happening, my wife would know. That places Natalie in a very specific role. She is not just Mackenzie's mother, she is the authority on Mackenzie's inner world. And once Natalie is placed in that role, her knowledge, or lack of knowledge, starts being treated almost like proof. But closeness is not omniscience. A mother can know her daughter deeply and still miss things, and even when something is said, the meaning of it can be minimized or reclassified. So the question is not just, did Mackenzie tell Natalie? It is, how much weight should we give Natalie's interpretation of what Mackenzie did or did not mean? And Steve makes that same argument again in another interview with True Crime This Week. In this next clip, notice that the idea is almost the same. Different interview, same anchor point. Natalie would know.
If there's a problem, who to call? She talked to my wife all the time. If these two kids were going to break up and there was a problem, my wife would already know. We would have known it, okay?
There it is again. She talked to my wife all the time, and my wife would already know. We would have known. And to be fair, people often repeat themselves in interviews. That does not automatically mean anything sinister. If you're going into interviews about your daughter's murder conviction, you probably do have your main points mapped out. But repetition still matters because it shows us where the family's version of reality is anchored. And over, Steve anchors it in Natalie. If Mackenzie was going to break up with Dominic, Natalie would know. If there was a serious problem, Natalie would know. And because Natalie did not frame it that way, the public is asked not to see it that way either. That is a lot of weight to place on one person's interpretation, especially when that person is not neutral. She is Mackenzie's mother, emotionally invested. She loves her daughter, of course, and wants to protect her daughter. And that does not automatically make Natalie dishonest. But it does mean we have to be careful about treating her interpretation as objective fact. Because then Steve goes even further. He does not only use Natalie to explain the relationship, he uses Natalie to explain Mackenzie's mental state. Here, in this interview with Chris Cuomo, Steve is asked about whether Mackenzie could have been suicidal. And again, the answer comes back to Natalie.
And if my daughter was suicidal, my wife would know. My wife talked with my daughter about everything. My daughter told my wife everything.
This is a part that really stands out to me, because now Natalie is not only being used as the person who would know if Mackenzie and Dominic were breaking up. She is being used as a person who would know if Mackenzie was suicidal. He says, my wife talked with my daughter about everything. My daughter told my wife everything. But that creates a problem, because if Natalie is a translator, then Natalie is also being treated as the proof. She translates what Mackenzie meant, and then her lack of knowledge is used as evidence for what Mackenzie could not have meant. So in other words, if Natalie did not know Mackenzie was, planning to harm herself, then Mackenzie must not have been suicidal. And if she did not understand Mackenzie's alarming statements as warning signs, then the family can treat them as something else. Teenage drama, or anxiety, as she says, grief is another one, exaggeration. And that is where the meaning filter comes in. The issue is not only whether Mackenzie said certain things. The issue is who got to decide what those things meant. Because if Natalie decides Mackenzie did not really mean it, then in the family's version of reality, it almost becomes as if Mackenzie did not really say it. And that brings us to another layer of this, the family's actual private language. In the True Crime This Week interview, Steve is asked about Carney Talk.
It's Carney. It's gypsy speak. It's a family thing that my wife grew up with.
Can you speak it?
No.
That answer is short, but it matters. Because Steve is very confident that Natalie would know. She would know if Mackenzie and Dominic were breaking up. She would know if Mackenzie was planning to harm herself. Mackenzie talked to her about everything. But when it comes to this particular communication channel between Natalie and Mackenzie, Steve says he does not speak it. So I think it is fair to ask, is part of the reason Natalie is positioned as the one who knows because she and Mackenzie shared a language Steve was not fully inside of? And I want to be precise. That does not mean Natalie lied to Steve or that she intentionally left Steve out of everything. We don't know the private dynamics between Natalie and Steve. And so we don't know what exactly the family system was in that respect. But we do know that Steve himself describes this language as something between Natalie, Mackenzie, and the girls. Something fast, familiar, and private. And listen to how he describes it.
It's like twins speaking a weird language.
That is Steve's comparison, not mine. He describes it as almost like twins speaking a language. And again, I'm not saying this proves anything nefarious, but it does support the larger point. Steve is outside the language, but he is relying on the translation. And that becomes important when we hear Natalie herself talk about this language. In her interview with the JFK Channel, Natalie explains where Carney Talk came from.
It's like inbred in my family. We all speak it, like all of us, all of our lives. It's called Carney Talk.
Natalie says it came from her family and that they all speak it. But apparently not Steve. So now Steve's repeated "my wife would know" has a different layer. He's not just pointing to a close mother-daughter relationship. He's pointing to Natalie as the person who understood Mackenzie, even though Steve himself says he does not speak this private language. I'm not saying Natalie is lying, and I'm not saying closeness between a mother and daughter is suspicious, but she is not neutral. She's emotionally inside the story. And that matters when Steve keeps asking us to trust her interpretation. And maybe interpreter is not even the full word for it, because in some of these moments, Natalie does not seem to be simply interpreting Mackenzie's meaning after the fact. She may also be helping create the meaning Mackenzie adopts in real time. She may be part interpreter, part protector, and part co-author of the narrative. And that is what I want you to keep in mind before the next clip. Natalie is not just comforting Mackenzie here. She is also bringing Mackenzie a version of the outside world. In the larger call, Natalie is telling Mackenzie about people defending her, people saying she is nice, people saying there is no way she did this intentionally. In other words, Natalie is curating the reality Mackenzie is hearing. And then Mackenzie takes that one step further.
I feel like something about like me and the whole like something that changed. Like it's gonna be like, you know how you read about them like famous court cases?
Yeah.
It's like school and stuff. I feel like my case is gonna be like that. Or an eye opener.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be.
It could be. You always were a mover and a shaker.
That is the dynamic I'm talking about. Mackenzie says she feels like her case is going to be like one of those famous court cases people read about later. And Natalie supplies the phrase, an eye-opener. That's important because Natalie is not just responding to Mackenzie's reality. In my opinion, she is helping to give language to it. Mackenzie reaches for the idea, Natalie names it, Mackenzie accepts it, and then Natalie validates it. Yeah, that could be. You always were a mover and a shaker, she says. That is not simply a mother saying, I love you, I'm here for you. Be careful what you say on the phone. That is not just legal caution. That is emotional reinforcement. Natalie is helping Mackenzie stay inside a version of reality where Mackenzie is misunderstood, supported, wrongly judged, and maybe even destined to become some kind of larger example. And to be fair, there may have been people defending Mackenzie at that point. Natalie may have been seeing comments from people who believed there was more to the story or who felt Mackenzie had been treated unfairly. But the issue is not whether the supportive comments existed. The issue is what Natalie chooses to amplify for Mackenzie. Natalie curated the reality Mackenzie was hearing. And then in this moment, she helps Mackenzie give that reality a name, an eye-opener. And this is why this call matters. Because if Natalie is the person translating Mackenzie for everyone else, then this call raises a fair question. Is she translating from a place of clarity, or is she translating from inside the same protective story? This is not about accusing Natalie of creating a secret plot. It is about recognizing a communication pattern. Mackenzie says something alarming or self-focused. Natalie softens it, redirects it, names it, or validates it. Steve relies on Natalie as a person who would know, and then the public is asked to accept that interpretation as truth. That is a chain, and in a case where intent is the central issue, that chain matters. Because the family's argument often depends on what Mackenzie supposedly would have said to Natalie, what Natalie supposedly would have known, and what Natalie understood Mackenzie to mean. But that is not the same thing as evidence. It is interpretation, and interpretation can be shaped by love, fear, loyalty, and denial. It can also be shaped by a mother trying desperately to protect her daughter from the full meaning of what happened. And that is why Steve's repeated statement matters. She told my wife everything. My wife would know. Those lines are not throwaway comments. They tell us where the family's version of reality is anchored. It is anchored in Natalie's understanding of Mackenzie. But after listening to these calls and interviews, I think the question becomes unavoidable. If Natalie is the person translating Mackenzie for everyone else, can we trust that translation? That is what makes this so important to me. The issue is not only what Mackenzie said, it is who got to decide what Mackenzie meant. And in this case, that role keeps pointing back to Natalie. So let me know what you think. Do you hear this as normal mother-daughter closeness under impossible circumstances? Or do you hear something more complicated? A family translation system that may have protected Mackenzie from accountability, even while the public was being asked to trust it. As always, please keep the comments respectful. We can analyze language, patterns, and public statements without attacking anyone personally. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.